Okay, cool. I've got a recording and a backup recording going, so I hope this will be solid.
Sounds good.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess how about I'll just get started, and then you're good. Are you good for like for an hour, or like let me know what?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'll make
Yeah,
sure.
an hour definitely works.
Okay, cool. I'm sure we could cover it all. All right, so I'll just go, and then I'll record an intro later on.
Sounds good.
Okay, everybody, super excited to present this interview with all of you today. Okay, that was stupid. Okay. All right, everybody, really excited to bring you this next interview in our 32 Beats beat writer interview series. We've got a good one. We talked to him last year about the Detroit Red Wings, and this year's going to be a little bit more positive, at least a little. He's former host of the Wings for Breakfast podcast, co-creator of Meta Hockey, and like a ton of other things. We're huge fans. Welcome to the show once again, Prashanth Iyer.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really stoked to talk Wings with you. And yeah, I just listened to our interview from last year where we talked about the Wings like historically bad season. And I feel like we're going to be able to have a bit of a more positive spin this year. Like compared to 2019-20, you could say 2020-21 was kind of like a success, right? The Wings, not only did they not come in last place, they like tied for fourth last. So, okay, that's already a nice improvement. They tied with Columbus. They were ahead of Buffalo, Anaheim, and New Jersey. And if you look deeper, the Wings kind of look even better. Like if you just focus on the games after February 20th, maybe they just had to work out some kinks or something. For these last couple of months, they went 15-15-7 in their final 37 games, good for 19th in points percentage in that span. That's ahead in that span of the Montreal Canadiens, who are currently in the conference finals. You could say the Wings are basically like a semifinal team, right?
Yeah, I mean, effectively that. And then if you throw in the fact that as bad as the Wings were in 2019, 2020, they still beat the Canadiens all four times they played. You might as well just say that they belong to be in the conference finals at this point.
Yeah, and then next thing you know, if Montreal could beat Vegas or Colorado, maybe we're talking about the Wings as a potential Stanley Cup champ. But maybe I'll start a little bit back from there. But yeah, I'd like to start with this more optimistic note of like, instead of last year's how were the Wings so bad, maybe we could start this question by asking, do you see this run at the end of the past season as an indication that the Wings are like a team on the rise that potentially might even be able to be a fringe playoff contender as soon as next season? Or is it more like, yeah, maybe they just overperformed a bit during that final stretch? They had some amazing goaltending in that run, and they still have quite a bit of a way to go before they're going to be really competitive.
I think it's a really great question because I mean, when we were looking back at 2019, 2020, they were 23 points behind the Senators who were,
Yeah.
second last there, right? So you were 23 points behind the second worst team in the league. And obviously this year, in a shortened season, they were able to do much better. They actually bettered their point total from the 1920 season in the shorter season. And, like you said, over the back half of the season, they played extraordinarily well, including a really tough month of March where I think a lot of people, including myself, were very nervous how Detroit was going to do in March. They had 3 games against Carolina. I think they had 2 games against Tampa. They had a couple games against Dallas, a couple games against Nashville, basically playing entirely playoff teams that entire month. And, they came out looking pretty okay from all of those games. And it sort of gave you some hope moving forward because not only did the Wings do that against a tough schedule, they bettered their point total from last season. They did it despite having a lot of injuries. Tyler Bertuzzi didn't make it out of the month of January. Robbie Fabry missed, 15 plus games on the season. He was a big, piece for them. Dylan Larkin missed time this year. Anthony Mantha is traded at the deadline. So a lot of the guys that we thought were going to be core people missed a huge chunk of time for the Red Wings this year. And at the end of the day, they still had a better record than they did the season before. And so I think, at least things are looking a little bit up here.
They did need those guys. They had Adam Ernie.
Yeah, I mean, Adam Ernie finishes. If you took prop bets at the beginning of the season and placed the bet that Adam Ernie was going to be the leading goal scorer for the Detroit Red Wings in 2020, 2021, you probably got outstanding odds on that because I don't think anyone would have ever expected him to do that, finishing the season with 11 goals, which actually led the team. So
that's wild.
He took over that back half of the season.
Yeah, so I'll definitely ask about him and these other forwards. But yeah, just to get back to my original question, like, so do you think this is a sign? Like, if you were to make now a bet on next season, what kind of odds would you need to take a bet that the Wings will make the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, so next season we should see Moritz Seider come over. He should be in the lineup from day one. That'll be key. But really, it's so tough for me to say what they're going to look like next year because effectively the entire roster can be turned over this offseason. The Wings have 50 million plus in cap space and could go down a number of different avenues. Whether they want to get really, really crazy and they want to go out and they throw an offer sheet at somebody, they go sign a Dougie Hamilton, they could go be crazy like that, or they could decide that they want to tear it down a little bit more and potentially trade Jacob Vrana, trade Tyler Bertuzzi, and try and acquire even more draft capital. So I think that's what makes it so difficult to project the Red Wings, is because I just have no idea the direction that they want to go in. That being said, if they do opt for a more, I think, aggressive approach in free agency, which I don't think is the likely scenario here. They could be a playoff contender as early as next season, but I think more likely you're looking at least still 2 to 3 years from now before they're kind of knocking on the door, in my opinion.
I see. Okay, yeah. So maybe we should just stop this interview now, and then we should reschedule for a couple of months from now. I was kind of looking at the Wings as a team that at least like the main core pieces seem to be in place. But you're right, with all this cap space, they could just bring in more and more core pieces and potentially turn this into a good team rather quickly. Yeah, what I brought up about their hot run at the end of this past season is this goaltending like really came out of nowhere and they were great. Like in last year's interview, we talked about Jonathan Bernier, and you were saying that you saw him as like a potential top 5 goalie in the league, and or at least that was the caliber of his season 2019-20. Like he only had a 907 save percentage overall, but like under the hood, looking at the quality of shots against, you were saying that he really looked really fantastic. He had an even better year, at least over the hood, in 2020-21. He had a 914 save percentage instead of 907 in the 24 games he played. At times he was even looking better than a 914 goal. He went on a couple of runs where he was like having just like 4+ games in a row of 2 or fewer goals against, leading to, of course, Brian and I pumping him up on the podcast, telling people they should add him to their fantasy leagues just for him to like completely blow up like that 7 goals against game against Nashville after we said, everyone, maybe you should go jump on Jonathan Bernier. But regardless of that, he's now an unrestricted free agent at the end of this season. And obviously I want to talk about Thomas Greiss also, but do you have a sense right now of what the Wings are planning to do with Bernier, trying to get him back, or do you think they're going to go with Greiss and someone else?
I think my sense is that they'll bring him back. He has expressed already that Detroit would be his number one option for where he wants to come back and play next season. I think him and Greiss worked really well as a nice tandem. I think Thomas Greiss had obviously a much slower start to the season, but Greiss really found his game in the month of April, and I think they formed a formidable duo, allowing sort of Blashill to alternate between the two and make sure that they were both well rested while giving the Red Wings every opportunity to be in every game. And I think because of Bernier's desire to come back, I don't think he'll be particularly expensive for the Red Wings. And I think if you sort of couple in the fact that there is no goaltending prospect knocking on the door in Detroit, there is no Spencer Knight, there is no Yaroslav Askarov or anything like that. Really, the best goaltending prospect in Detroit's system is Keith Petruzzelli, who to this date is still unsigned, and looking to potentially go back to the NCAA for another season next year. So I think all that being said, I think Bernier is likely to be back in Detroit. It seems to be a really good system fit for him, and I would expect him to be there potentially on a 1 or 2 year deal.
Yeah, I guess though I would imagine maybe he could get like more years, or do you don't think that's possible? Like he's had a good couple of seasons, so I wonder if he could maybe get a longer term deal for himself.
I think he would be able to get a longer term deal if he opted to go somewhere outside of Detroit. I think one of the things that Steve Yzerman has done a really nice job of thus far in Detroit is avoiding handing out term to his free agents.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the Red Wings cap friendly page right now, there are 2 forwards, and they're the only 2 forwards on the roster that are signed beyond 2021, 2022. They're, in fact, they're the only 2 players, and it's Dylan Larkin and Richard Panik, a contract that he didn't sign, but he acquired. Nobody else is signed on the roster beyond then. And so I think he's done a nice job of minimizing term. And so that's why I don't think if Bernie wants to come back to Detroit, he's going to get more than 1 or 2 years. But, at his age being 32, if he opted to go elsewhere, I think he certainly could get a longer deal. It's just going to come down to what he wants to do.
Yeah, and I guess what kind of offers come in. So, okay, so I have this random goalie in my dynasty league that I added a free agency, Philip Larson. You're saying that he's not someone I should be expecting to do anything?
No, Philip Larson, I think 2 years ago would have been the guy that a lot of people were really excited about. He had a really solid season over in Sweden, and then had come over to the NCAA, looked great in Denver. was an outstanding goaltender in Denver. And so then in 2019, 2020, the Red Wings tried to bring him up to Grand Rapids in the AHL, and he bottomed out very badly. In fact, got himself sent down to the ECHL, struggled to play for the Toledo Walleye down in the ECHL. Then this past season, kind of spent it back over in Europe, struggled once again. I don't see a path forward for him to the NHL, in my opinion. Now, certainly, he could turn his career around, and he definitely has the potential to, because he's shown it in the NCAA. But at least over the last 2+ years, we haven't seen an NHL caliber goaltender in Philip Larson.
Okay, fair enough. And not that bad, but it was looking like maybe you would say similarly bad things about Thomas Greiss. Like you said, at the start of the season, he came off really slow. He was just having games in a row of letting in 3+ goals. Like you couldn't get a game of him having, a quality start. Then all of a sudden, like this switch flipped. And by the end of the season, he was like looking like one of the best goalies in the league. Actually, I just like randomly made a cutoff of March 30th. From March 30th on, he had the best save percentage in the entire league of goalies who played at least like 7 games. In a 13-game span, he had a .946 save percentage. So I'm just curious, like, what happened with Thomas Greiss? Was it just that he was getting acclimated to a new system? Like, how does a goalie go from being so bad to so good, just like on a, what do they say, like something of a dime, on the edge of a dime? What's that saying?
I mean, like basically, he did it just out of thin air is kind of what happened, because you're absolutely right. Like if you use April 1st or March 30th as your cutoff and just look at Thomas Greiss's goals saved above expected, he led the league from April 1st to the end of the season. That's the final 6 weeks of the season. He was the best goalie in the league. It's crazy. It's sort of weird. Like it just came out of nowhere, because at the beginning of the season, he was the worst goalie in the league. Really over the first kind of 3 months, he was struggling so bad that Jonathan Bernier was really getting all of the starts. And that was part of the Red Wings struggles, was I think Greiss was sort of struggling to maybe play behind the defense of Detroit, which, coming from the New York Islanders, coming from Barry Trotz's system, I think some people expected some growing pains there, because obviously Trotz plays a really tight defensive system in New York. The Islanders have been really, really solid. They're a far better team than Detroit was in 2019, 2020. And so Greiss coming over and joining that, I think I expected some growing pains. I did not expect him to struggle as much as he did. And so I really think what you saw over the final 6 weeks was maybe more of a return to what his baseline can be, as opposed to, something unexpected. And I think Greiss can be that caliber of goaltender. The stats he put up were sort of in line with what he did in the Islanders years with Trotz. So, maybe it's just adjusting to how to play behind Detroit's system, sort of learning how to rein in the aggressiveness and where to be and where to direct pucks and where his defenseman's going to be and what lanes they're going to take away. I do think there's a little bit of an adjustment period there. And I think he sort of showed that he figured it out by the end of the year.
Yeah, it was wild. And I guess when you put it all together, the slow start and the strong finish, he ended up with a .912 save percentage overall, which is basically the exact same thing that he had in 2019-20 with the Islanders. So maybe that's just what we can expect moving forward. He is 35 years old. I guess at some point he's going to slow down, but hopefully for the Red Wings, he has at least one more good year, that last year of his contract. By the way, for people yelling at their phones, it's on the turn of a dime, or on a dime, I guess is what I was trying to say. I don't know. I shouldn't try to be pulling these sayings out of my butt like that. Okay. So of course, there's only so much a goalie can do to help the team not letting goals. And the Wings have generally not been known to have such a strong defense, but I've got to imagine that they must be excited to have this big ringer coming in next season with Moritz Seider looking like he should be ready to start his NHL career. We actually asked you at the end of our podcast last season who would be a good sleeper, like someone that people might not expect to do so well then have a good 2021 season. And you picked Seider, expecting that he'd, I guess, make it to the NHL at some point. And you were saying that he might even be the #1 D-man on the team by the end of the season. So that didn't happen. He ended up playing in the SHL instead, and most recently was named the top defenseman in the World Hockey Championship that just wrapped up. So do you have a sense of why the Wings decided to wait a year on Seider? And am I right to assume that he'll be with the big club this season?
Yeah, so he'll absolutely be a lock for the Red Wings this season. And truth be told, if this past season was really a normal season, he would have been in Detroit. I think given the uncertainty of when the NHL was going to start and the fact that the SHL was able to get up and running a little bit earlier, the Red Wings elected to sort of loan Moritz Seider out to the SHL. And because of the way the loan system worked, they couldn't recall him until his team finished. And
Oh,
because
I
he
see.
made Rogla so good, Rogla made it all the way to the finals. And by the time Rogla lost in the finals, the season was over for the Red Wings and he wasn't going to come back. So really the main reason why Moritz Seider was over there was simply there was just uncertainty about when the NHL season would start. And the Red Wings wanted their best prospect playing. And, I don't think I was out of line in sort of expecting him to be the breakout player because he went over to the SHL and was the defenseman of the year in the
Oh,
SHL
okay, yeah.
and then goes to the IHF Worlds, right? And is the best defenseman there and is named to the All-Star team there. So really he's now coming to Detroit with monumental expectations over the last that have really kind of built up over the last year because he does go to the third best league in the world in the SHL and is the defenseman of the year over there as a 19, now 20-year-old defenseman, and then goes to the IHF Worlds and is the defenseman of the tournament over there on the All-Star team. And so now I think a lot of people are really excited. And I think as soon as he hits the ice in Detroit, he's going to be the Red Wings' best defenseman.
So like, what do you think we should expect from him? Like from a fantasy perspective, like what kind of production do you think that we can expect in year one?
He's not going to be an attractive fantasy player because I don't think he's going to be a guy that puts up a lot of point totals. I don't know that you'll necessarily see him on power play one in Detroit. You'll see him on the penalty kill, but where he'll be valuable, depending on the league setup, will be he's going to play a lot of minutes. I think by the end of the season, he's going to be a 20 to 22 minute kind of guy. He'll throw a lot of hits. If hits is a stat that your league plays with shots, he's another guy that's going to be able to do all of that. I'm sort of expecting over the course of an 82 game season, he's probably a 20 to 25 point defenseman with maybe, 4 or 5 goals and 20 or so assists in that ballpark. But I think he'll be in the conversation for the Calder next year. Just given if he can play with that steady, pace, he seems to do a really nice job of making breakout passes. He does an excellent job of tilting the ice and, his team's favor. I think that was one of the attractive things about him in Sweden was he had a 5-on-5 Corsi for percentage north of 60% for most of the season, which is, sort of ridiculous to be able to do that as a 19-year-old. But unfortunately, a lot of that doesn't get measured in fantasy hockey, making him sort of a less exciting prospect in that regard.
Oh, okay. Well, still, maybe one impact you'll have is helping Bernier and Thomas Greiss have better seasons because they'll have a stronger defenseman there. And I guess that would then be good news if you're not expecting Seider to take over on the top power play. Then maybe Filip Hronek will have a chance to build on what was, I guess, kind of a disappointing 2020-21 season. Hronek was, sorry about that. So putting up. Hronek ended the season with 26 points in 56 games. That's a 38-point pace, similar to what he did in 2019-20. But unlike 2019-20, he seemed to suffer from a bit of bad luck. He only had 2 of his 114 shots go in the net. That's a 1.8 shooting percentage, well down from the around 7% that he had in the previous 2 seasons. So I did some quick math here on the back of a napkin. And if he would have shot at 7% and took the same number of shots, that means he would have scored 8 goals instead of 2. And we'd be talking about a 47-point pace player instead of a 38-point pace player, which is obviously a huge difference. So now that you're saying that Hronek probably gets to stick on the top power play for another year, is it fair to conclude that the underlying numbers indicate that he has more in him and maybe we could expect a 45 plus point defenseman next year? Or maybe I shouldn't just assume that he gets that shooting percentage back. Maybe there was something actually wrong this year.
Yeah, I mean, so the funny part about the shooting percentage that you bring up, both of his goals that he scored were on an empty net. He didn't actually beat a goaltender this season. So, he did not score on a goalie in this NHL season, which is fascinating when you also see that he led the Red Wings in points with 26. So, putting it all together, I think Filip Hronek's a really tricky case. He's a guy that's playing, I think, above his means right now because he has to. Detroit does not have anybody better than him defensively. And so he's being asked to go out there, play 23 minutes a night, play on the top power play, play on the top penalty kill, do a lot of different things, match up against the opposition's best player. And frankly speaking, I don't think he has the capacity to handle that. And I think you've seen that over the last 2 years where really, I think his game has sort of dipped from his initial rookie season in 18-19, where I think people were really excited about the promise he brought, thinking he'd be a half a point per game player, get you some power play points, get you some assists. He has a big slap shot that you really like to see on the power play there if they can set him up, on that left-sided left face-off dot. None of that really manifested this year in Detroit. I think he tends to take far too many shots from the perimeter. He actually was somewhat disruptive on the power play this year by sort of shooting the puck when he probably shouldn't shoot the puck. Either it'd be a shot from the point when he really had space to step in, or it'd be a shot from the point where there was no traffic in front and there was no reason to really take that shot, and it ends up being an easy whistle. So, moral of the story, I think with Moritz Seider coming over and potentially being able to handle some of the more defensive responsibilities, I do think you may actually get more point totals out of Filip Hronek. I do think you might be able to see him get back to that 40-point pace because he's simply going to have less defensive responsibilities and can focus more on playing that offensive game. He won't be Seider's D partner. They're both right-hand shots, so they're likely going to be on two different pairings. But I think Seider's pairing is going to be the one that will sort of match up against maybe the better opposition and allow Filip Hronek to play a little bit more aggressively.
Oh, that's interesting. So Seider coming in like opens him up to express more of his offensive abilities. Oh, that's exciting. Maybe that could make him a little bit of a sleeper going into next season. Because I'll bet you there's going to be some people that on the face of it are just going to be seeing, oh, now there's a competition coming in. So maybe that will eat into Hronek's value, but you're saying it might actually boost it. So that's cool. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think it may actually boost his value simply by he's not the central focus and he's not having to invest so much time and energy into the defensive side of the puck. I think if he's able to get a little bit better offensive matchups and sort of look for his offense a bit more, I think he's a guy that does have a little bit more reserve in him than what we've seen sort of the last season and a half.
Cool. And okay, this is like just a question I have to ask because I have no idea what your answer is going to be. After Hronek and Seider, who would you say is going to be like the third best defenseman on this team? I bet you there's a lot of listeners that couldn't even name a third defenseman on this team.
It's really tough. And again, I think some of it's going to depend on what they choose to do in free agency, given that they can basically turn over their entire defense. But in terms of guys on the roster, for me, it's Troy Stecher. I think, Stecher was an outstanding signing from Vancouver this past offseason when Jim Benning elected not to give him $1.7 million. And Stecher, we just saw him have a great, Worlds tournament, helping lead Canada to the gold medal as sort of Canada's top defenseman. He was playing 27, 28 minutes a night with Owen Power, who's likely the first overall pick. I think Stetcher's a dynamic skater, a guy who can really join the rush and sort of help out. Now, that being said, him, Seider, Filip Hronek, they're all right shot defensemen. They all play on that side. So they're probably all three on different pairings, although Stecher can play a little bit on the left side. But he's probably my pick for the third best defenseman, assuming Detroit does not go out there and get somebody else.
Yeah, but I guess you're saying if they have the cap space, why not get someone? I'm just looking through a list of unrestricted free agents that are left shot defensemen. Obviously, Dougie Hamilton's a right shot, so that I guess maybe doesn't make the most sense. How about like Alec Martinez?
Alec Martinez is a guy that's been tossed out. Jamie Alexiak's a guy that's been tossed out. There's a handful of guys out there that I think would make some sense, and I suspect Steve Yzerman will do that. There's even been rumblings that the Red Wings bring Mark Stahl back because he actually did not look that bad this season, contrary to I think what a lot of people expected.
Right.
So it's sort of tough to say what they're going to do on the side of their defense here. There's the potential they buy out Danny DeKeyser. Maybe Dennis Cholowski gets in Detroit. It's all
sorry. Actually, there was an internet glitch there. Can you just go again from where you're saying maybe Cholowski? I didn't catch what you said.
Yeah. So just potentially Dennis Cholowski might get a little bit bigger role, but it sort of depends on how Detroit, what they elect to do in the expansion draft, if they choose to protect him or not.
Right.
He's a guy that's sort of his future in Detroit is up in the air, but end of the day, it's really hard to see what they're going to do on the left side because there's just so many possibilities.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So speaking of that expansion draft, is Cholowski, in your opinion, the front runner to be the guy that Seattle ends up taking?
I think it depends if Detroit elects to protect Troy Stecher or not. And that's really been the central question. People have sort of read into what Herman suggested about not wanting to lose his restricted free agents, for nothing. And that would be sort of Dennis Cholowski and Gustav Lindstrom are the two defensemen that would need to be protected in addition to Filip Hronek. And so if that's the case, then Troy Stecher would actually be the guy that I think Seattle takes. And if they elect to protect Stecher, then I think potentially it's down to Evgeny Svechnikov or Dennis Cholowski. So will be interesting to see how the Red Wings proceed there.
Yeah, and then also who Seattle ends up going for. All right, so I guess that's the D and goalie talk. Let's get to these forwards, and I gotta start by asking you, of course, about Dylan Larkin, who we just did our last interview with Sheng Peng about the San Jose Sharks, and I was joking with him about how we were talking about Erik Karlsson on last year's interview, and we were like, oh, Karlsson had like a 70-point pace in 2018-19. Like, what happened? He only had 60-point pace in 2019-20, and we were like, oh, do you think he'll go back to the 70-point version? And then in the end, he ended up just like spiraling down to like much worse. We would have wished that we could have had 60-point Erik Karlsson. And I feel like it's pretty much the same situation with Dylan Larkin, because we were talking to you about his 61-point pace season 2019-20, being like, do you think he could get back to being the near point per game guy that he was before? And instead, Larkin like nosedived, had the worst season of his career, at least offensively, only 23 points in his 44 games before Jamie Benn cross-checked him, ending his season early. So that's a 43-point full season pace, which is not great. So yeah, was Larkin just straight up not as good of a player as he used to be in his age 24 season? Or I'd imagine you'd have access to all the great variance markers that could maybe, I don't know, I guess I'm hoping that you'll be able to say that Larkin just suffered from bad luck and there's nothing to worry about. Or do you think that this was a sign that maybe he's starting to have his game fall off?
I think it's so tough to evaluate him on his point totals because of the way Detroit plays. And really, that goes for a lot of the guys on Detroit's team this year. I think number one, Detroit had a historically awful power play this year. At one point, they went 41 consecutive power play opportunities without a goal, just something absolutely ridiculous that shouldn't happen. And I think they ended up finishing with a power play that connected around 10% of the time. And so, that's one of the five worst power plays of the last 20 plus years since they started tracking, power play success in 1997, 1998. So I think that certainly factored in to his point totals not being where they're at. And then at 5-on-5, the way Detroit plays is extraordinarily conservative. They're a defense first hockey team. They're a team that plays a 1-2-2 forechecking system that has really the two forwards that are not the primaries sort of drifting back, because they're all about shot prevention. They actually sell out to play the shot prevention style. And that's why when you look at Detroit's sort of advanced analytics and see a little bit about what they're doing, you see they do a really nice job with shot suppression and sort of doing a good job of limiting quality opportunities against, but it comes expensive. They're not taking risks to generate their own chances. And I think that's what you've really seen in Dylan Larkin's game is you're not going to see him flying down the ice, really chasing offense with the way the Red Wings are constructed. Now, that being said, I do think he has an opportunity for his offense to pick back up next year because Tyler Bertuzzi will be healthy, and Tyler Bertuzzi's been a longtime line mate of Dylan Larkin, and Bertuzzi was very limited in action this year, which I think significantly hampered Larkin's productivity. And then the second piece is if Jacob Vrana ends up playing on the line with Dylan Larkin. Jacob Vrana is an amazing hockey player. He came into Detroit and was almost a goal per game player in the 11 games he played for Detroit. And so if he's there with Larkin and potentially Tyler Bertuzzi, that has a potential to be an immensely creative line that I think can score a lot of points. But it'll all depend again on if Bertuzzi's back is really healthy and if Vrana ends up being back as a restricted free agent, which I suspect he will be, as opposed to the Red Wings trading him there. And if those two things happen and they're able to play with Dylan Larkin, I think Larkin has the chance for his point totals to really soar.
Yeah, that makes sense. We actually had the interesting discussion in the episode from last season. I'll link to it in the show notes if people want to go back and hear the talk with Prashanth a year ago. But yeah, it was a similar discussion about Larkin where you were saying that he was really hampered in that year by Anthony Mantha being hurt. And you were saying that like Larkin's not like one of these elite centers that can just carry a line on his own. Like he'll get a lot of points if he has someone really good that he can, play with. And it seemed like this season, like you said, like Bertuzzi was injured. Mantha, I don't know what was happening with Mantha. Actually, he was getting bumped all over the lineup before he ended up getting traded. So yeah, that would be exciting to see if Larkin can turn it around. But as far as the system in Detroit, I assume that we shouldn't be expecting that to change. So we're just gonna have to hope that the line mates will help elevate him regardless.
Yeah, I think you're not going to expect the system to change because Jeff Blashill has obviously been brought back on a 2-year deal in Detroit, and so he will be back next season. What you should expect to change is the power play. Dan Bylsma has run the power play for the last 2 seasons. The Red Wings have been the worst power play team in the league. Dan Bylsma will not be back next year, and so the Red Wings are looking for a new assistant coach to come in and run the power play and run the forwards, which may offer that power play a little bit more success because again, if that power play can get back up to around 20%, from 10%, that's a potential, 20 more points that you're looking at for a guy like Larkin, who primarily plays on power play one, to be able to be a part of. So, that's where I would, if you're really trying to sell out on Dylan Larkin's production coming back, it's going to have to happen on the power play.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, clearly he's going to be undervalued going into fantasy drafts next year. So yeah, obviously a good guy to swing on if you could get him, especially later on. Yeah, so you've brought up both Vrana and Bertuzzi. I definitely want to get your takes on both of them. So let's start with Vrana. So in our episode last year, you had a ton of praise for Anthony Mantha. You referred to him as like a top 15 winger in the league on like multiple occasions, but then it seemed like, or correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed like Coach Blashill didn't agree with you. Like he was bumping Mantha kind of up and down the lineup through the first like 3/4 of the season, which likely contributed to him having like Larkin-esque numbers and having a down year himself before he got traded at the deadline for Vrana. And then like Vrana then was having an okay season with the Caps. He had 25 points in 39 games. And like you said, he had some huge games with the Wings, including that 4-goal game versus Dallas, those couple 1-goal, 1-assist games at the end of the season versus Columbus, giving him 11 points in 11 games in Hockey Town. So yeah, I guess first I'd love to just get your take on Mantha. Like what happened with him this season? Like, what do you think like caused his numbers to go down when you were so high on him? And what did you think of the deal when it originally happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think Mantha is an outstanding hockey player. He's a very gifted hockey player, but I think one of the big, frustrating aspects for him this season, at least for the fan base with him, was his effort was somewhat inconsistent from night in into night out. And I think that's what you saw with Jeff Blashill, making him a healthy scratch at times, moving him all over the lineup, benching him in games. He wanted to see a more consistent effort from Anthony Mantha, because when Anthony Mantha moves his feet, he is an outstanding power forward. He can really do a whole lot of things. And even after he was dealt to Washington, he sort of came out and said that the system in Detroit was somewhat frustrating for him to be able to play in. And I think that sort of factored into, maybe a potential lack of effort, or not necessarily 100% commitment that Jeff Blashill sort of wanted to see. And I think that was what ultimately led to the deal happening was, Mantha being 26 years old, and the Red Wings are sort of saying, okay, we know we're not within the playoffs probably in the next 1 to 2 years, and we want to make sure we get the maximum value from Anthony Mantha. And so if I can trade Mantha for a guy that's 1 year younger than him, that can effectively produce at the same rate, if not a little better, and also add a first round pick in 2021 and a second round pick in 2022.
Oh, right.
Well, then, yeah, you have to do that, right? And so that deal is Anthony Mantha for Jacob Vrana, then Richard Panik, and then a first round pick in 2021 and a second round pick in 2022. And Vrana then comes in and puts up 8 goals in 11 games, including a 4-goal game with Detroit. And so it's like, okay, I think the first thing I took away from that was I didn't realize how good Jacob Vrana was. Yes, the stats were all there, that he was, a top 5 goal scorer in the NHL at even strength over the last 3 seasons, literally up there with Pastrnak and Austin Matthews. But I wanted to see what would happen if you gave him more ice time and you did it in a bad, in a bad offensive team like Detroit, and not necessarily playing in Washington behind, Ovechkin and Backstrom and Kuznetsov and Oshie and all those. And he sure enough came to Detroit and did great. So, what I'm sort of expecting is if Vrana can give you that kind of production next season, then the Red Wings are walking away from this deal saying this was an absolute home run of a deal.
Yeah, for sure. Well, especially if you're saying Mantha just like kind of doesn't fit in with this system in Detroit anyways, then maybe it could hopefully be a win-win. Like, I mean, if you're a Washington Capitals fan, but yeah, it definitely looks good for Detroit, especially with how Vrana did in that short stretch. So obviously it's hard to tell. It's such a small sample size, but do you think that is an indication of what we can expect next year? I know you've kind of mentioned that maybe the Wings will trade him. I find that hard to believe that they would do something like that, but I guess we'll have to see what kind of contract he wants as a RFA. But assuming he sticks with Detroit, he's been around a 60-point guy over his past couple of seasons in Washington, but this is like without getting top power play deployment because he's behind all those guys in Washington. Now, I guess there should be no obstacles for him to get all the offensive deployment that he's able to handle. So do you think that we're looking at still a 60-ish point guy, or do you think there's upside for more?
Yeah, I think you're still probably looking at about a 60-ish point guy. I don't know that he's going to get a ton more ice time in Detroit, at least at 5-on-5. But where he potentially will get more of a role is on the power play in Detroit. But that being said, Detroit's power play is a far cry from Washington's power play.
Well,
So
yeah.
even though he'll play a lot more minutes there, that power play does not have Alexander Ovechkin. It doesn't have Nick Backstrom. Doesn't have TJ Oshie. So it'll be tough to say exactly. I think he probably comes in a little under 60 points. I'd probably guess somewhere between 50 and 55, just factoring in less production on the power play, but potentially a little bit more production at 5-on-5. But I think he's still going to be in that ballpark, making him just a hugely valuable forward.
Yeah, I think the Wings are definitely happy to have him. Yeah, and these picks in exchange for Mantha. I guess he'll have to be the one that helps turn the power play around. It's kind of like how Nashville had that terrible power play. I was like, oh, how's Ellie Tolvanen going to produce? But then, as Brian likes to say, like Tolvanen, I guess, was part of the big reason why they were able to start scoring some power play goals. So we'll have to see if Verona can help with that. And like you keep mentioning, a healthy Tyler Bertuzzi could obviously not hurt at the net front. We had a really interesting discussion about him last year. We were talking about how he's had this high shooting percentage in his career. And you were saying how he's like, doesn't take a lot of shots because he's generally like, at the front of the net and maybe getting rebounds or redirections or something like that. But it seemed like that high shooting percentage like was once again going to happen, at least with the 9 games that he did play. He had 5 goals on 20 shots, and it was looking like he was on track to potentially put up one of his best seasons, like 7 points in 9 games. Obviously, that's just a couple of weeks, but then he left that game at the end of January, at the end of the second versus Florida, never returned, eventually undergoing back surgery on April 30th. For what I'm seeing on NBC Sports Edge, Tyler Bertuzzi is expected to be back. As my dog is breathing in a crazy way, but okay, she's just excited about Tyler Bertuzzi. So yeah, he's expected to be back and healthy next season. I'm curious to get your take on like what should people be expecting from Bertuzzi. I'll bet if someone like Larkin's going to go under the radar, like I'm sure Bertuzzi's going to completely miss the radar. Like people probably don't have him on their minds at all. And like you said, he's like, I'd imagine, or correct me if I'm wrong, is he going to be coming back to like this like top line, top power play with Larkin and maybe he'll be able to be again like a 50 plus, maybe 60 point guy?
Yeah, I mean, back injuries are so tough to see if he's able to come back and be exactly the kind of player that he was before. But if he is, I mean, at the beginning of the season in January, he was the only guy scoring for Detroit. Really, he was driving all of their offense. He was the guy getting things done. And when he ultimately was not able to continue after January, I think that was a huge blow for the Red Wings offense. And really, I think the biggest guy who suffered was Dylan Larkin. And so if you're able to bring Tyler Bertuzzi back 100% healthy, put him on the top line, and like I said, give him another winger on that left side, whether it is Jacob Vrana or Filip Zadina, you're talking about a very potent top line that scored very well for the Red Wings over the last year and a half, albeit Mantha was on that other side instead of whoever the Wings may put there. And Bertuzzi figures to slot in on the top power play as well. So I think he's a guy poised for potentially a huge bounce back season, potentially a career season if he is truly 100% healthy. I think he's a guy that would also be able to sniff that 50 to 55 point territory, potentially around 20 goals as well, if he can be totally healthy.
Talking to you, it kind of makes me excited for the Red Wings next year. I'm excited to see what they can do. But obviously this big if, right? They need everyone to be healthy. 2 years ago, it was Mantha that was hurt. This year, Bertuzzi. Jeff, everyone's there. And if the goaltending could be close to as good, I don't know.
I mean, it's exciting. Now, granted, we've talked about the only 4 players that are really notable on the Red Wings. And as soon as we're out of guys to talk about at this point, because we've talked about the ones that are really, really good. And no, I'm being somewhat facetious here, but bringing Mo Seider over will be really exciting. Bringing, Tyler Bertuzzi back healthy. If you're able to bring Jacob Vrana back, I think that'll make the Red Wings a little bit more exciting to watch, and they will have a little bit more offensive potential. But a lot is going to hinge on the health of those guys. A lot of that's going to hinge on having a better power play in place. And if they can do those things, there might be some valuable Red Wings for fantasy hockey here.
Sure. And maybe that'll include a UFA that they're able to sign in the offseason. Yeah. So I still have some more players that I want to ask you about. So we'll get to that in just a sec. You're listening to Keeping Karlsson. Sorry, I'll just insert a ad break there. Okay. Okay, so yeah, like you said, maybe we're going to have a bit of a fall off from the Bertuzzi, Larkins, and Veranas of the world, but still a highly touted prospect on the team that I want to get your take on next is Filip Zadina, who I guess had a bit of a disappointing sophomore season. He had only, do I have this right here? Yeah. Oh yeah. 6 goals and 19 points in the 49 games he played. He spent some time playing with Larkin. His most common line mates, though, were Gagne and Nemesnikov on I guess the second line. Hard to tell like which lines are which on Detroit. But on the plus side, Zadina was playing almost 17 minutes of ice time per game, which seems pretty good for just a 21-year-old. So what do you think the vibe is on Zadina from the organization and the Wings fans at the moment? Like, are they looking at this past season as a disappointment, or are they saying like, okay, this is like a good progression for this kid and we expect him to be an impact guy in the near future?
I think it's somewhere in between. I don't know that anyone would sort of write him off as a true disappointment, or I should say, there will be some people that do that, but I think majority of people aren't going to say that was a really disappointing season. I think, we have to recognize the context of Detroit being this very aggressive defensive system, and sort of Blashill has a way that he wants to coach these younger players and sort of wants to make sure that they learn the basics of defense before they start sort of reaching and trying to force plays. So I think all of that has to factor into the evaluation. But at the same time, this wasn't an overwhelming success. I mean, a guy who was billed as being a great goal scorer, a guy on draft night who said, "I want to fill Montreal's net with pucks." Only put up 6 goals in 49 games, and that's not really going to get it done for the Red Wings for a guy who is 6th overall. And because it's Detroit and Quinn Hughes was right there, it's always going to be that conversation that you passed on Quinn Hughes for Philip Zadina right there. So for me, I think it's somewhere in between. I think he's looking more like a complete hockey player. And I think the last few games playing with Jacob Vrana, you could tell there was instant chemistry there. Those two guys seemed to play really well together. They went over to the Worlds and they played together for the Czech team at the Worlds, and they had great chemistry over there. Both of them had 4 points in the games that they played in. So I think moving forward, Vrana's a guy that I think could really bring a lot out of Philip Zadina. Again, it sort of depends where Vrana plays, if he plays on the top line, if he plays on the second line. But I am encouraged. And the thing I sort of have to remember is he's 21. And he's a guy that I think this was still his first full season. He only played 28 games last year, played 9 games in 2018, 2019. This was really his first full season and first full crack in the lineup. And so I think he is a guy that is going to start to figure things out. And potentially, if you can give him a little bit more talented line mates than Nemesnikov and Gagne, he may be able to do a little bit more.
Yeah, like clearly no one thought that he was going to be at this young age like a McDavid that could just carry a line. So yeah, I definitely am also heartened to see a potential of him playing with better players like Vrana. I guess we were expecting Vrana to do a lot of heavy lifting. If right now we've already decided that he's going to help Larkin and Zadina now have better seasons.
I mean, he's basically the guy in Detroit. He's, I was joking about this with Max Boltman, who's the beat writer for the Athletic Detroit and covers the Red Wings. But I mean, Jacob Vrana is arguably the most skilled player the Red Wings have had on their roster since Pavel Datsyuk left.
Oh, wow.
Better than Thomas Tatar, better than Gustav Nyquist, arguably better than Dylan Larkin. I think he's the most skilled offensive player they've had in their system and really in Detroit since Pavel Datsyuk, left. And so when you sort of put all of that together, he is a really exciting player for the Red Wings to have around, and potentially, depending on where they end up slotting him in the lineup, he's a guy that could have a huge impact offensively for a number of guys who I think in Detroit aren't necessarily line drivers, but can have their game elevated by guys who are.
Right. And I guess one player who I'd be curious to know if you think he fits either category or was just a complete aberration. I joked about him at the beginning of the show. Adam Ernie, I got to ask, like, is anything that we saw this past season something that we can expect to repeat next year? Like you said, I guess I didn't even realize this. He led the team in goals. He had 10 goals and 6 assists in this like 24 game stretch between the end of February and mid-April before kind of like going back to being Adam Ernie at the end of the season. But is this someone that it should be at all like on my radar, someone that could do something impactful again next season, or do you expect him to go back to being like a bottom sixer who no one ever talks about?
It's so tough because I don't think anyone really expected this to come out of him after what happened last year. But, I think you sort of have to throw it back that Adam Ernie was a point per game player in his draft year in the QMJHL. Now, granted, the QMJHL is a higher scoring league. Point totals don't seem to mean as much in that regard. But he was a guy that scored almost 30 goals in his draft year in 68 games for Quebec, and then went down to the AHL in the Tampa system and was basically a half a point per game player down the AHL, which is generally pretty promising. Struggled to sort of crack this vaunted Tampa lineup. And so Detroit was able to get him just for a draft pick, prior to 2019, 2020. And then he sort of flopped. He had 2 goals and 5 points in 56 games in 1920. And so I think expectations were sort of at an all-time low, but he had very clearly shown that he had some offensive prowess, at least in his past. And I think that's what you saw come out when Detroit sort of struggled with injuries, with Robbie Fabry getting hurt, with Dylan Larkin missing time, with Anthony Mantha being traded, with Tyler Bertuzzi out. Somebody needed to step up. And the guy that really stepped up was Adam Ernie. And he started to actually show this just incredible ability to join the rush, fly down the wing, cut to the middle, get his shot off. He showed a really nice goal scoring touch. And truth be told, I mean, it's hard to argue that that's not that he can't replicate that, particularly if he gets some other guys back in the lineup that can take the attention away from him. Now, that being said, with all those guys missing time in Detroit, Adam Ernie did get power play 1 time, which I don't think happens again next year when Detroit's fully healthy. And so that may certainly hamper some of his production if Detroit's power play picks up. But he certainly looked good at 5-on-5, and he's potentially a guy you could pencil in for maybe, 25, 30 points somewhere in that ball game, and maybe somewhere between 12 to 15 goals if everything goes right.
Yeah, I guess we'll see if he gets to line up with someone good or not. But yeah, I definitely could see him doing something again. And he's still kind of young, right? He's only 26 years old, I believe. So I don't know. I feel like going into the year, if you would have asked me, I would have assumed he was like a veteran of the league. But no, he's still pretty young. So maybe we just haven't seen what he can do because this is the first time he really got an opportunity. Okay, but switching now to the really young people, let's get to the prospect chat, which I know a lot of people are always excited to hear about. And I guess the first thing I should ask you is the Wings have the 6th overall pick coming up in the NHL draft. And so I'd love to get your sense of what the Wings should be hoping to do with this pick. We have a patron, Shams, who is a big fan of the Wings for Breakfast podcast. He said, I needed to ask you if the Wings should look to draft a goalie with that 6th overall pick.
Well, as people who listen to Wings for Breakfast, they've heard me rant about this time and time again. I strongly feel that the Red Wings should not take a goaltender. Really, no team should take a goaltender with, your first pick in the draft. I think the draft capital there, the value you can get from a forward or defenseman is much higher. The certainty in which what you can get is much higher. And then you sort of couple in the fact that you can get a lot of really decent goaltending out of free agency. I mean, Detroit's both their goaltenders came out of free agency, Bernier and Greiss. Yeah. I'm sort of against going down the road of a Jesper Wallstedt or Sebastian Cossa as they're probably the top 2 goalie prospects. At 6, it'll be really interesting to see how the draft breaks. I don't know that there's really anybody consensus that won't be there outside of Owen Power. I think he's probably a consensus top 3 guy for most teams, likely the first overall pick. But after that, it's sort of tough to say how the rest of the draft breaks. I think one guy I sort of have my eye on as potentially falling to the Red Wings is William Eklund, who is a center / left winger, in the SHL, played for Jurgen. I think he's a really talented offensive player, arguably the most talented offensive player in this draft. I think he really adds some nice skill. The only question mark is if he's going to be able to play center at the NHL level, since his skating isn't necessarily quite as good as you would hope it would be for someone there, and he doesn't necessarily have prototypical size, but he's sort of the guy I would have my eye on at 6.
Okay, yeah, I actually meant that goalie question as a joke, but then as I was researching for this interview, I found a mock draft on NHL.com by Adam Kimmelman, and he said that he'd draft Jesper Wallstedt at 6.
I mean, there's a lot of people. I think Craig Button had Jesper Wallstedt to Detroit in his mock draft. So Adam Kimmelman's not the only one. A lot of people were doing this. I think Cam Robinson, of elite prospects, also put Jesper Wallstedt at 6 to Detroit. Tony Ferrari of Dobber prospects put Jesper Wallstedt at 6 to Detroit. So don't worry, it's not just Adam, but I would vote strongly against that.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And like you say, maybe they could get this talented center left wing. They do. I guess I asked you before about like who is the 3rd best defenseman on Detroit. I guess I could ask you the same question about who's the 2nd best center on Detroit currently, because I'm looking at one prospect in Joe Veleno, who was the drafted in the same draft as Zadina over a 30th overall. He played most of this season in the SHL before he did get 4 games with Grand Rapids, and then 5 games at the end of the season with the Wings, where he even scored his first NHL goal. And like, I know I shouldn't expect too much from a 30th overall pick, but at the same time, like I was trying to look like who does he have to beat out to be like the number 2 center on this team next year. So I'm curious to get your take. Like, am I right to assume that Veleno might be the number 2 center next year?
Yeah, it's absolutely within reason here. Is he's likely going to be either the second or third line center for Detroit, barring them going out and
Right, and
getting somebody in free agency, which would be a little bit surprising. But at least what's on the roster right now, I don't think Nemestikov slots ahead of him. Rasmussen, as much as Detroit wants him to be a center, I don't think he's going to be able to play center at the NHL level and will likely play on the wing. Veleno was able to play a little bit at center for Detroit this season. I think in a perfect world, Detroit gets him in as their third line center. However, like you said, I don't know who's going to be able to be better than him next season. Maybe they get a little creative and they try and convert somebody into a center, but they don't have any center prospects knocking down the door. I think Theodor Niederbach, who's arguably their best center prospect, is not ready to be in the NHL next season. And so I think Joe Veleno is probably the guy that may end up playing second line minutes for Detroit.
Yeah, so definitely, I guess, a name that we should probably get familiar with. Though at the same time, I guess it was, who was it? Sam Gagne as a second line center this past season. It's not as if he was someone especially noteworthy. So maybe it's not that significant.
It sort of depends. I think the second line center position this past year was actually primarily played by a lot of different guys. I mean, Robbie Fabry played a little bit at second line center. You had Nemesnikov play at center. You had Val Filppula play at center. You had,
That's Rasmussen.
Rasmussen played a little bit at center. Veleno played at center. Gagne played at center. Glendening even slotted up in the second line and played at center there. So it's anyone's guess as to who actually does it, but I think Veleno's got to be the leading candidate as of now.
Cool. I actually have him in a Dynasty League that counts faceoffs, and I saw that he won a few faceoffs in the.
He looked really good. He was he was working a lot with Luke Glendening, who's a faceoff extraordinaire in Detroit, and so he was working with him on faceoffs. And I think what you have to like about Veleno is he plays with great pace. He plays with great pace. He's got speed. He's got skill. He just needs to be able to put all those pieces together at the NHL level, which we haven't really seen enough to know if he can do.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we'll learn this year. And then I guess, am I correct in assuming that the number 1 prospect in the system right now is their 4th overall pick from this past year, Lucas Raymond?
It'd probably be a toss-up for people between Lucas Raymond and Moritz Seider. I think if you're not considering Moritz Seider a prospect anymore, since it's likely a slam dunk to be in Detroit, then yeah, I absolutely agree. Lucas Raymond's probably the best prospect. I think he has the highest ceiling of anybody in Detroit's system. There's a solid chance he's primarily just in Grand Rapids next year in the AHL, but I think there's an outside shot he does get some time in Detroit next season.
Yeah, well, he just finished his age 18 season in the SHL, 18 points in 34 games with Frölunda. So yeah, maybe he plays the Veleno route, like, goes in the minors, then comes up at the end of the season, and then people get excited about him. And then we could be talking in our interview in a year from now about what to expect from Lucas Raymond. And I guess what would that be, 2022, 23?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the likely round. I think you'll see him in Grand Rapids for most of next season, with potentially a couple of games in Detroit towards the end of the year.
Like, are people happy with what they saw out of Raymond since they drafted him? Like, is it considered a good season to have 18 points in 34 games in the SHL?
Yeah, I think the context with how Frölunda plays, Frölunda is very similar stylistically to Detroit. They're one of the lowest scoring teams in the SHL. They're a very sort of slow, methodical defensive first team. So again, the point totals weren't necessarily going to pop off the charts. Then Lucas Raymond missed significant time with an injury this season that ended his season. And so, with all of that being said, I still think taking 18 points in 34 games is a reasonable, step from him. I think you still see the creativity there. You see the lethal shot. You see the playmaking. All of the tools are there. I think it's just the point totals aren't necessarily there because of him playing in Frölunda. I'm really excited for him in North America and smaller ice in a different system. How does his offensive, style really emerge?
Right. Okay. Yes, that'll be fun to watch. Are there any other prospects that you think I've missed? Like, I guess one guy I was reading about is Jonathan Berggren, who had 45 points in 49 games in the SHL this past season. I guess on maybe a more offensive team than Frölunda.
Yeah, Berggren, he's an outstanding player, 2018 draft pick for the Red Wings, second round pick. He's a guy that we haven't really been able to see much of the last 2 years because he's been hurt. He had a pretty nasty back injury, I think in 2018, 2019, had another injury last year that knocked him out for a period of time. But this season, totally healthy. He's just an incredible playmaker. He's a guy that can dance with the puck, has excellent vision, a guy that I think could really quarterback a power play, was a point per game player in the SHL this season. Granted, he is a couple years ahead of Lucas Raymond in that regard. He's another guy I would expect to see in Grand Rapids next season. Sort of making the transition to North America again with an outside shot to be in the NHL next year. Only other guy that I would also put in sort of that same tier is Albert Johansson, defenseman in Detroit. So he's also in the SHL, as if you can't tell, everybody in Detroit plays in the SHL. But he had a really, really nice season. Quietly, almost scored as well as Moritz Seider did in terms of a points per 60, standpoint in the SHL. He's another guy that's sort of flown under the radar for the Red Wings. I think he'll also be in Grand Rapids next season. I should say potentially be in Grand Rapids next season. It's sort of, he's the one that we're not sure of yet, whether it'll be SHL or Grand Rapids. I personally think he would benefit from being in Grand Rapids next year. So he's another one to watch, as potentially being a guy in 1 to 2 years who can be a real smooth skating offensive defenseman.
Wow, I don't know, Prashanth. Like maybe I'm just falling to a trap here, but I'm getting into the Detroit Red Wings talking about them with you.
I mean, there's a lot of guys here that are really exciting. It just all depends on if everybody sort of hits that potential and meets, what we're all expecting and hoping for, which we know is never the case, but
yeah,
there's certainly reason for excitement in Detroit.
yeah, right. Of course. Okay, so I guess that takes us. Okay, so I guess this takes us to the final thoughts here. So last year I asked you, like I referenced before, to like predict like sort of the biggest surprise and maybe the biggest disappointment for 2020-21. You said Seider is the biggest surprise, which I guess we can call that a wash. You chose Robbie Fabry actually as someone that you expected to disappoint us, and he actually wasn't that bad, right? Like 18 points in 30 games before all the injuries caught up with him. Were you impressed with Fabry? Like, did he do better than what you were expecting?
Yeah, I think he scored better than I was expecting. I think part of what I was expecting was when he first came to Detroit in the trade for Jacob De La Rose, he actually scored a couple goals in his very first game and looked really, really promising. And I think everyone was sort of excited to see him in a full season in Detroit. But I knew that he was going to get asked to play second line center. That was going to be a tough role for him in Detroit. He also seemed to be a guy that was much more of an offensive first slash not as much defense, sort of player, and how well would that mesh in the system. But I was pleasantly surprised with him. I thought he scored way better than expected. While the second line center experiment didn't work out, I thought he still was a valuable piece for the Red Wings, and ultimately their offense suffered when he was hurt. So he's a guy that I think if he's again back healthy next year, can definitely be a huge impact player for the Red Wings on the second line.
Yeah, I guess this will be a contract year for him. So he'll be very motivated to try to have a big season. And then, yeah, so I guess let's do the same exercise again, predicting for next year. I guess I wonder if I could almost guess based on the conversations we've had, but I'd love to get your thoughts on like who's a player that you think might be under people's radars that might, surprise people, be able to get late in their fantasy drafts and then feel like big geniuses by the end of the year. And then someone who maybe people might reach for and end up regretting it.
Yeah, I mean, the guy that I'll say it'll be a surprise you can probably get late in the year is Tyler Bertuzzi. I just think only playing 9 games this past season, he's not going to be on a lot of people's radars. If he's totally healthy from this back injury, I think he can be, give you almost a first line forward production. And so
Yeah.
he's a guy that I would definitely pencil in as a guy that can definitely, play for you and play well at the next level. And then the guy that I would sort of say is likely to be the biggest disappointment. It's hard to say here, but I'd probably pick Thomas Grace. As much as I just talked him up and sort of said that he got back to what his benchmark was in the Islanders, he is 35. He's going to be 36 next season. At some point, these goalies do fall off the cliff. We did see him really struggle at the beginning in Detroit this year. I have to wonder if the bottom falls out for him next season, and if Jonathan Bernier ends up, if Bernier ends up being back and sort of takes a little bit more of a stranglehold on the starter role. I think really the only reason Grace got as many games as he did was Bernier missed several games with injury this year. If Bernier's healthy back next year and ends up re-signing in Detroit, I think you might see the split go the other way, and you might not get as many games out of Grace.
Yeah, definitely hard to argue with both of those picks. I agree with you. I think it would be a bit of a foolish move to, bet big on Thomas Greiss once again, leading goalies in save percentage over that kind of stretch again.
It would be
So
really surprising.
yeah, it was, but hey, it happened. So Prashanth, this has been so fun. The time just flew by. So if people, obviously love this interview and they want to hear more from you, where can people follow all of your great work?
Well, right now, really just on Twitter at Iyer_Prashanth. That's at IYER_PRASHANTH. And, usually that's where you'll get all my different random thoughts.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, we'll definitely link to that in the show notes. Thanks so much again for talking to me all about the Detroit Red Wings. And hopefully when we do our interview next season, it'll be, more happiness and excitement about an improving team.
Hopefully we're still on the upward trajectory.
Yeah. Okay, well, have a great night and thanks again.
Thanks, man. You too.
Cool. What a great interview. I love talking,
Thanks.
man.
Yeah, it was good stuff.
Cool. Yeah. So I'll just message you let you know when it's out.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Thanks again.
Yeah, no problem.
See you.
All right. Bye.
Yeah. Yes. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Keeping Karlsson Fantasy Hockey Podcast, the longest running fantasy hockey podcast in the world, hosted by two guys who totally called that Adam Ernie was going to have that great run this past season. Okay. Um.